Hello and welcome to this literature revision system lesson on Robert Browning's poem Porphyria's Lover. This is designed to prepare you for the love and relationships question in the AQA GCSE Literature course. Okay, the context for this poem, it's a dramatic monologue, and that's when a writer takes on the persona, the personality of an imagined or a fictitious character and writes as if they are that person. Using the first person. So Browning pioneered this new form around about the start of the 19th century, and very often the personalities that he creates are unreliable, and you cannot necessarily trust their view of things, their take on the world. Very often there's a kind of confessional form to the poem. This particular poem was inspired by a crime reported in a popular magazine of the time called Blackwood's Magazine, and it was a genre of true crime reporting that became popular in the 19th century. So it was very modern, the topic that Browning chose to write about. It's an exploration of mental illness. Porphyria is a liver condition, actually. It's a physiological condition that actually can cause psychosis, and it was a disease that had been discovered or had become known about during Browning's lifetime. Porphyria had just been identified at that time, and psychology became a new science later in the 19th century. So again, it was a very modern topic that he chose to write about. Browning himself was a passionate atheist, certainly at the time of writing this poem. And the poem, as we'll see, challenges Christian dogma, Christian thinking. Okay, so this is the poem itself. The rain set early in tonight, the sullen wind was soon awake. It tore the elm tops down for spite, and did its worst to vex the lake. I listened with heart fit to break. When glided in Porphyria, straight she shut the cold out and the storm, and kneeled and made the cheerless grate blaze up, and all the cottage warm. Which done, she rose, and from her form withdrew the dripping cloak and shawl, and laid her soiled gloves by, untied her hat, and let the damp hair fall, and last, she sat down by my side and called me. When no voice replied, she put my arm about her waist and made her smooth white shoulder bare, and all her yellow hair displaced, and, stooping, made my cheek lie there, and spread o'er all her yellow hair, murmuring how she loved me, she too weak for all her heart's endeavour to set its struggling passion free from pride, and vainer ties dissever, and give herself to me forever. But passion sometimes would prevail, nor could tonight's gay feast restrain a sudden thought of one so pale for love of her, and all in vain. So she was come through wind and rain. Be sure I looked up at her eyes, happy and proud. At last I knew Porphyria worshipped me. Surprise made my heart swell, and still it grew, while I debated what to do. That moment she was mine, fair, perfectly pure and good. I found a thing to do, and all her hair in one long yellow string I wound 3 times her little throat around, and strangled her. No pain felt she. I am quite sure she felt no pain. As a shut bud that holds a bee, I warily oped her lids. Again laughed the blue eyes without a stain. And I untightened next the tress about her neck. Her cheek once more blushed bright beneath my burning kiss. I propped her head up as before, only this time my shoulder bore her head, which droops upon it still, the smiling rosy little head, so glad it has its utmost will, that all it scorned at once is fled, and I, its love, am gained instead. Porphyria's love, she guessed not how her darling one wish would be heard, and thus we sit together now, and all night long we have not stirred, and yet God has not said a word. So to summarise the content then, the narrative of that long dramatic monologue, the speaker known only as Porphyria's lover describes a stormy night and his heartbreak, presumably because he misses Porphyria, who seems to be out at some social event. She returns from the party to be with him, and she tries to comfort him. He feels comforted, but then he suddenly strangles her as if to keep her with him forever. He spends the night with her body and is amazed that God has not done anything. Okay, As always, we're going to focus on three key ideas: the beginning, middle and end. I've highlighted those in yellow and blue and green, as we'll see on the next slide as well. So it'll be useful for you to make some notes to highlight the same quotations in your copy of the poem, in your anthology perhaps, and to use the annotations on the screen to build up your own set of notes around these quotations. So you start to connect these ideas with the quotations because they'll be the focus for our analysis. Again, we're preparing for a three-part analysis that will help us construct a grade 9 essay. So first of all, we're going to look at the opening of the poem. And the first key idea I'd like us to focus on is the pathetic fallacy, the way that the weather is used symbolically in this poem to establish a kind of gothic, disturbing and disturbed mood, which reflects the speaker's unstable state of mind. Those descriptions of cold, rain and storm help to build that pathetic fallacy. The sullen wind, so sullen suggests that the wind itself is spiteful or grumpy or annoyed and acting in spite. And this is personification, isn't it, of the weather. And it suggests the speaker's irrational and paranoid mind. That sense of imbalance is conveyed in the rhyme scheme, the asymmetrical rhyme scheme as it's called. And that's when you have the coding for the rhymes are A, B, A, B, B. For example, we've got night and awake, and then spite that rhymes with night. So we've got A, B, A, and then lake and break. So it's not a balanced rhyme scheme, it's asymmetrical. And that suggests this sense of the disturbed mind. Also with the form of the poem, this long, unbroken verse of varied line lengths, it adds to this sense of overwhelming, uncontrolled emotion. The first direct description of the feelings, of his actual feelings, I listened with heart fit to break, also breaks the poem's iambic tetrameter to indicate his lack of self-control. So that's a form of a rhythm. If you look at the vocab slides, the free vocab lesson on the Literature Revision System's website, you'll see a full explanation of this new technical terminology and the new vocabulary. So I suggest that you check that free lesson out, please. So we've got this break in the rhythm here to indicate also this lack of self-control. So the opening of the poem is to establish the disturbed mind of the speaker. Okay, so if you'd like to pause to continue making your notes, I'm going to move on now to the second paragraph of analysis. And we're focusing on the build-up of the momentum in the poem, repetitions, and also that symbolic description of him being pale for love of her. So the speaker seems to be submissive to the woman, doesn't he? The title suggests that he's Porphyria's lover. He has no other identity other than being her lover. He seems to belong to her. He is pale for love of her. So that quotation connects to that idea that's intimated by the title. That suggests, doesn't it, his weakness, the pale complexion. Browning may be suggesting that the speaker's need to control of his beloved as the motivation for murder, perhaps. He wants to regain control, regain power. He wants to make her mine, and that's a quotation we'll see from the end of the poem in a moment. The repetition suggests the obsessive thoughts that drive him to kill. So apart from the repetition of that phrase, which we'll see in a moment, there's also the repetition of and throughout the poem to create this kind of sinister momentum, implying the speaker's inability to control his thoughts will inevitably spill over, will possibly inevitably lead to a murder. As I've suggested, there's a fatal inevitability about that rhythm. Okay, so moving now to the end of the poem, and it's the comments now in green I'd like us to focus on. A couple of things really here. So the speaker seems to be submissive to the woman, we've mentioned that. But here at the end, the lover strangles Porphyria. He found a thing to do is the phrase that initiates this attack. The monosyllabic childlike language there, though, isn't it? I found a thing to do. Just words of one syllable. Very simplistic. It suggests perhaps how emotionally detached he is from his actions. It suggests he is acting on impulse as if he has what we would call now diminished responsibility. He strangles her as if in spite, and that's to quote a word from the description of the weather at the start of the poem, with the yellow hair that he adored. It's ironic, isn't it, that he uses that hair that he loved to kill her. We get this the little description of her smiling, rosy little head is interesting. There's a very twee, sweet semantic field there, isn't there? Smiling, rosy little head. Used to describe her death. It evokes a perversely sentimental image of nurturing an infant, doesn't it? We imagine a small child being nursed. And so that conveys this complete insanity, that he's just murdered this girl, and yet he describes her in this very twee way. At the end, he triumphantly exclaims, "And yet God has not said a word," and that may suggest his deranged joy that he now possesses her, or perhaps it may suggest his excitement that he feels he has literally got away with murder. Okay, but beyond that, Browning, who was quite critical of Christian religious thinking at this time, at a point in his life. Later he changed his views, but I think he could have been here making an ironic criticism of religious belief. The ending may have been designed to prompt the reader to consider how such a brutal, senseless crime could be committed without divine intervention or retribution. Okay, so a long and complex poem full of rich language we could explore. But as always, we're focusing on those three ideas to make it this manageable and to make our revision efficient. And we're going to be applying those in this petal framework, writing framework, which corresponds quite neatly to the assessment objectives of the mark scheme. So if we apply this framework, we can be confident that we'll be picking up marks in the exam. And so that's what I'll lead on to show you now. If we look at those first notes from the start of the poem on the pathetic fallacy and the quotation, "I listened with heart fit to break," those could be written into this paragraph. He begins with descriptions of cold, rain and storm that create a pathetic fallacy to reflect the unstable mind of the speaker. The southern wind acts in spite, and this personification suggests an irrational and paranoid mind. This sense of imbalance is conveyed in the asymmetrical rhyme scheme, AB, ABB, and the long unbroken verse adds to a sense of overwhelming emotion. The first direct description of his feelings, "I listen with heart fit to break," also breaks the poem's iambic tetrameter to indicate his lack of self-control. Okay, so if we look at how that petal framework applies, as we've got the colour coding here, we can see that there's a lot of really specific, high-level technical terminology there. We've got the quotations blended into the essay style and detailed analysis and developed argument, all of which would score highly against the mark scheme, at the top levels of the mark scheme. Okay, and as always, of course, this is not an essay that you'll write focusing on just one poem. It's a comparative essay task, and those of you who are familiar with this sequence of presentations will know that I recommend that we subdivide love and relationships into the categories of romantic love or family love, and that for each we will focus on one key poem with which we'll compare the other thematically linked poems. So we could imagine comparing Porphyria's Lover to Sonnet 29, I Think of Thee, which is the key poem for the romantic love, and the introduction therefore could look like this. Both I Think of Thee and Porphyria's Lover describe intense desire and emotion. However, Browning's sonnet is an intense expression of love for her fiancé, whereas her husband's dramatic monologue describes a disturbed, obsessive emotion that leads to murder. Because indeed, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, her surname, she took from her husband, Robert Browning. Okay, so that's a possible introduction. I would immediately establish this response as a comparative response and therefore pick up marks for that. Now, If you check the link below, you'll see the link to the Literature Revision Systems website, where there are a full range of lessons, and you can download the exclusive ebook, which has a revision system that will take you through a progressive sequence of lessons to enable you to secure grade 7 and 8 and then a grade 9, sharing model essays and a series of step-by-step exercises to help you support your learning of the skills and knowledge you need to secure each of these grades. Okay, so if you found this video useful, please like it and be sure to check the next lessons. Thanks for watching Literature Revision Systems.